Namaskar. I am Akash Jaiswal from Dharma in Real Time. Welcome to one and all. We welcome you to the first of many conversations as part of the Epistemic Disobedience series conducted by the Brihaspati Center for INDIC Research on Decolonization under Dharma in Real Time. Today, we have with us Rakshit Rajesh, Chair, and Vikram Rohan Iyer, co-chair of Dharma in Real Time with us as panelists. We aim to dispel certain preconceived notions that may be rooted in ignorance and misconception of factual realities at play. To begin this conversation and to set the theme of this conversation right, the introductory question is this, which is open to both of you. What is Indic ethos? How has history shaped or fractured it? And to be very honest, why should the random layman from India even worry about this thing called Indic ethos? Why should he be affected by it? Why should he even bother to know about it? The floor is open to both of you. I would like Vikram to start talking about it.
All right. Thank you, Akash, for the lovely introductions. So I would like to answer your question by first talking about what is the Indic ethos. So it is rather strange that we are asking this question today, being Indians ourselves. And it is good that we're asking such questions, at least now, because we've lost a lot of time. We've lost quite a few decades, and actually we lost hundreds of years before that. So it is good that we're asking such questions today. But what we understand today as the Indian ethos, or what has become the Indian ethos, is largely a result of outside forces and their influences, rather than a voluntary exercise by members of the Indian civilizational society to, in fact, alter or create mechanisms as they see fit, which is in line with their cultural background, with their cultural norms, also which is relevant and particular, and that has been engineered to bring forward movement and progress. Because as you know, progress and forward movement in any society has to be determined and brought forward by that society. It cannot be created by a freak accident of outside forces. Neither can it be engineered by a society of outsiders who do not truly understand the real value or the real meaning behind some of the practices and some of the ways in which we conduct ourselves as Indians and as Bharatiyas, as part of our social life, our political life, as well as our personal lives. Because this is a very individualistic culture. So
essentially a certain fixation on sticking to their point of view and interpreting a different idea or seemingly a different idea with their preconceived ideas about it. So like a certain lack of flexibility with respect to their own vision and interpretation skills is what we can say.
And I think we should name names here. And say that this problem with this construct of who are the Indian people. Oh, they have no single history. Like, oh, they have no commonality. It is just it's a different bunch of people. If they all have different traditions, they have nothing in common with each other. It's a miracle how India hasn't fallen into complete, destruction and infighting amongst its various communities, because they have nothing in common with each other. So these are all themes that we heard from many Western and British, imperialists, probably, and also during the post-colonial times, immediately after independence or just before independence. These are things which I've heard a lot. And these are opinions that have also been echoed, as I have said in our previous talk, by Marxists in this country, Marxist scholars, who have interpreted and twisted history. Because I don't know how anybody can be a Marxist historian or any other kind of historian. Because history is just history. And you just got to be truthful to what you find there, and you got to use your good senses, and you got to use your common sense and also your sense of inner goodness to interpret like in a just manner. It doesn't make sense for you to be a Marxist anything or like or a conservative anything, because that means you're kind of veiling yourself and you're by even viewing something with a lens, as is very popularly referred to in today's academia, you are actually veiling your own vision. And unfortunately, Indians have fallen victim to this. Indians and Indian history has fallen victim to this, mostly because Indian people have lost most of their philosophical and scientific um, stores of knowledge. All the massive stores of knowledge of this civilization, which deal with science, which deal with mathematics, which deal with astronomy, which deal with logic, which deal with medicine, all of these were systematically destroyed during a series of foreign invasions.
We can very clearly see that because there have been batches upon batches of students, an entire generation which has read a very falsified, or at the very least a very distorted view of history in their schools. And once they started working, a lot of them were not really looking back into the time and looking back into their culture and reading up more. Their opinions were already formed by them. So a good number of Indian society in a way does sport a very wrong notion about what the Indian
Indeed.
culture really was about. Rakshit, what's your opinion on this?
Thanks, Akash. So actually, I have a lot of agreement with Vikram's hypothesis or explanation of the subject. In fact, for me, simply put, if I had to boil down the INDIC ethos to a couple of words, it would be a system of core cultural and historical values and traditions rooted in Sanatani Dharma that has played a very crucial role in establishing India as a civilizational force. When Alexander the Great from Greece had come into India, he was astounded by the heritage of 153 plus kings spanning over a vast history of about 6,400 years. And a lot of the sciences or the philosophies of the traditions that is usually placed at the plinth of Athens and in some sense justified by the faith of Jerusalem has been borrowed or inspired from Indic traditions. In fact, the Indian ethos is something that I would, if I had to draw an analogy, I would compare it to a stick shift or a manual transmission car. Whereas most Western philosophies or policies or let's say socio-economic ideas are more like an automatic shift, whereas the Indic way is more of a manual shift. It's all fine and dandy when you think you know your car very well, when you call yourself a conservative or a progressive, etc., etc. When your car is going smoothly, there's no hurdles, no stops. The second that car breaks down, when you open up the engine and you realize you don't know your car at all, that is the Indic ethos, right? So we have been the original mechanics of civilization, right from the Mohenjo-daro times to the current present. But unfortunately, somewhere along the way, we have gotten carried away with Western definitions of intellectualizing the civilizational proposition that we once heralded as our own and were very proud about. In fact, while I don't want to go too deep into it, in something like the Aryan invasion theory is essentially based on this idea, the linguistic nexus that was drawn between Sanskrit and foreign languages, European languages. The imperialistic agents that Vikram was talking about in his opening remarks, they were confronted with two questions. While acknowledging an existence of such a nexus, the first question was, did it come from Europe, the linguistic, let's say, the linguistic attributes of Sanskrit, or alternatively, did India give it to Europe? And since it wasn't very convenient to the White Sahib at the time to sort of acknowledge that India was a civilizational force in and of itself, they went on to introduce this idea that a white-skinned Aryan, which is a Sanskrit word, so they not only stole, in the words of Shashi Tharoor, I mean, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but they not only stole their habits, but also the word loot from our own dictionary and lexicon. And they looted this idea of Aryan, which means nobility in Sanskrit, and they attributed it to a white-skinned savior of a sort who gave an otherwise barbaric culture some civility, some civilizational ethos, which is so far from the truth. And unfortunately, we have entrenched ourselves in this idea that in this sort of praxeology of paganism, in a very Christian theocratic sort of perspective. And we believe ourselves to be products largely of colonial civilizational processes. And I think that's what the Indian ethos was and how it has been maligned and, let's say, bastardized in some sense.
Like nowadays, certain genetic studies and certain viewpoints very clearly argue about how this idea of Aryan invasion or Aryan migration is apparently utter nonsense. And some people often think that, oh, Aryan invasion theory is just some academic debate. What is the effect of it? Like, why are people even bothering to look into it? See, a lot of times they don't realize that this idea that a portion of the country might be actually outsider and stuff like that, that is used today by certain political forces or certain forces in general to actually create a divide in Indian society. So these things are very relevant for today.
Also,
like, it's
I'd
not
like to
just an academic debate.
Agreed. And I'd like to add that it's also sort of an exercise in redundancy, because the very fact of, or the very act of having to disprove the theory, how can you disprove something that has no proof to begin with? I mean, if I had to borrow one of the, to be honest, I mean, in an effort not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if we can sort of, acknowledge one good Western, let's say, facet of jurisprudence, it's the idea that it is on the one that claims to prove that a wrong has been committed. So the onus should not be, or the burden of proof should not be on us to disprove it, but on them to prove that such a theory has some vestiges in truth. And there is, be it in archaeology, be it in history, there is no shred of evidence that such a mundane theory it has any veracity to it. And in fact, I think it's just a political tool to further this idea that India, with its vast years of civilizational narratives and stories, was but a mere product of colonial experimentation in their idea of supposed progressiveness, to further such an idea. And yeah.
See, I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, honestly. So, how do you think history has fractured it, and what's your opinion on what do you think has history? What do you think is the role of history in creating this kind of an imprint in human psyche, or when it comes to Indian society? Because there are certain Indians who seem very indifferent to their own cultural narrative, probably because
hostile, even,
maybe
I would
because
say, I would argue.
Hostile even, yeah. Maybe because somewhere they feel they're being radical if they're exploring their origins, or maybe they have been brainwashed into thinking that Indian society has had a very, a very bad past, and they were like almost as if their ancestors were all savages doing all kinds of
the brown sahib
barbaric things. The Browns are
the brown sahib,
which is so untrue. Like,
there is some truth in that. There is some truth in that, to the extent that I feel it is true to the point of, from the point of view that, in fact, I would say most of the agents of desecrating this rich cultural heritage that we have come to, that has been bestowed upon us, has been desecrated by, in large part, by our very own citizenry, our ancestors, and some of our contemporaries. So I would sort of lay some fault, or some of the blame, to our very own brothers and sisters. In terms of the history and how it has fractured it, I think it's interesting. In fact, if you think of the idea of like liberal education, the maculae education, a little fun fact for the audience: the concepts like geometry, trigonometry, calculus, even before, in fact, Newton in some sense stole it. But combinatorics, which is basically, permutations and combinations, these were actually discussed 600 years prior to maculae education in gurukuls all across Indian rural towns and villages. In fact, Bhaskaracharya had written a book called Leelavati for his daughter, named after his daughter, to teach her mathematics. And it basically explained these ideas, number theory, with drawing comparisons with Vedic gods and deities. There's a famous
Ah,
problem called the Shiva problem. If Shiva has 10 arms and 10 different ayuds, 10 different weapons, then how many ayuds can you use in a certain given time? The idea of probability, permutation, combination, all of these things were explained in verse, beautifully so. And we have had, in some sense, in terms of like progressive education or knowledge, Kalidasa's, Raghuvansham has spoken about how the Gupta dynasty, in fact, were very forward-thinking and future-oriented rulers, progressive for their time in the true essence of the word progressiveness, and not the mundane, the rainbow economy or the political,
speaking of progressive ideas, education and economy.
Exactly. Not the
Well,
political,
I mean,
cheat code that the West often prides itself on owning up to these days.
yeah, that's actually true.
And
To be
funnily
very
enough,
fair,
funnily
yeah.
enough, the entire this entire exercise, as you were asking Akash, of like why is it that Indians today think that exploring their past or exploring their origins is like some kind of extremist thing to do, or anybody who's kind of trying to live as an Indian, trying to even possibly even wear a kurta, is looked upon a little bit as like okay, banda thoda strange kar raha hai. Like
Airport.
It's a little bit which is absolutely crazy and shocking to me as like an Indian person, because when the very vestiges of your civilization are looked down upon, there must be some deep civilizational trauma and some deep like generational trauma which has been passed down through the generations as a result of our shocking and quite deprecating experience with colonialism, which came in various waves. And the main reason for this is largely because this is the culmination of a very carefully propagated exercise of review of a certain method of reviewing Indian history and its events and portraying it to support European colonialism. So you will understand that generally when certain aspects of Indian history were studied, for example, as Rakshit very beautifully talked about the Aryan invasion theory, there is really no proof for this kind of theory, especially since the genetic studies are now out. It clearly points to the fact that Indians, even though they're coming from different regions in the country, are largely genetically just not different. There's no need to get complicated about it.
Vikram, clearly there has been a certain attempt, intentional or unintentional, I don't know, to interpret things in such a way that it creates
and I'm
a
going
divide.
I'm going to tell you why that is. Right? And
go ahead. Just go ahead. But one thing I would like to point out, which is in today's society, a lot of people are under this idea that Buddhism is essentially in conflict with Hinduism, which is very nonsensical, actually. So, I mean, I would like someone to explore on this, but this idea that Buddhism is in conflict with Hinduism, where has this popped up from? Like, is it really even true? Because the contrary seems to be true,
Yeah, it is absolutely
Vikram,
not
you were
true.
saying something.
It is absolutely not true that any Indic tradition, for that matter, conflicts with the other in the as is represented by the imagination of these Western scholars. Yes, they do conflict philosophically and in terms of intellectually in their discussions, and that is part of the grand debate tradition of India. Okay. And everybody knows about the exchange of ideas, debates sponsored by kings and entire kingdoms, where entire cities of people would come and watch the debates between two scholars from different traditions. These are all part of our history. So the reality of the situation, which the West fails to understand because of its monolithic Abrahamic mindset, is because they cannot even see outside that paradigm. They always have to construe things which appear superficially different in the way they express certain ideas to be irreconcilable differences, which mean they form completely different traditions which are in opposition to each other. When in fact, very clear textual evidence from the classical period of India, from the 8th, 9th centuries and even earlier 6th, 7th centuries, the tantric texts
which by the way, the tantric tradition, which has very clearly had become very, very prominent by this point, are clearly talking about the Buddhist Hindu syncretism within the text, which is obvious to anybody who will read this, because Buddhist texts dedicated to Buddhist deities are offering ritualistic offerings, are describing practices, ritualistic practices for making offerings to Vedic gods, such as Brahmanaspati and Varuna and Agni, as well as Maheshwara and Maheshwari. So one very horrible misconception that people have is, oh, Buddhists are completely non-idolatrous. They don't worship any idols. It's the backward Hindus who are always worshipping idols, and it's these enlightened Buddhists who believe in this some form of monotheism, who are the enlightened and intellectual people who are persecuted. And they were against idol worship, and they were against ritualism, which is this narrative which has been kind of foisted upon us, which is completely false. Because by the 6th century, the Buddhists were the pioneers in engineering scientific ritualistic practices for all manner of magical purposes. And this is very, very evident. This is very, very evident in the thousands, if not hundreds of texts which have been preserved today through other sources, from fleeing Tibetan and Chinese scholars who preserved texts from Nalanda, from the burning of Nalanda. All this is very obvious, and from contemporary sources such as Fahian, we are able, and other foreign explorers who came to India to visit Nalanda, or scholars who came to visit India to translate Buddhist texts and Hindu texts into their native languages, because this was considered the center of learning, and everybody considered this was a supreme center of learning. Everybody considered this philosophy to be great. What these contemporary sources are telling us is that there were millions of texts. There were millions of texts of the Siddhanta category, which is basically of your theory and basic understanding of science and logic and all of that. And the Tantra category, which is completely dedicated to spiritual practices and of magic and of self-realization and deity worship. And these Tantra texts were the most secret and most valued texts in Nalanda. And let's not get our facts mixed up here, because Nalanda and Takshashila and such universities at this point, even Marxist scholars acknowledge that these universities were dominated by Buddhism. And what does this mean?
I see.
This clearly means that the Hindu traditions and the Buddhist traditions of using mantras and bijas and of performing rituals and worshipping deities had clearly become adopted by Buddhism, because they understood that it was a very efficient way of attaining the same truths. And the primary problem,
fundamentally, both these cultures were seeing it as a very life science.
Precisely. And today's so-called trads or traditional people who want to go back to this so-called pure Hinduism, which is apparently against Buddhism, which is a Gnostic, kind of religion. These people have got their facts completely mixed up, and these people are the victims of colonization and the colonial narrative. Because the actual reality of the matter is that India was a very cosmopolitan culture.
In fact, forward thinking for its time,
very
because on the point of Nalanda,
forward thinking.
On the point of Nalanda itself,
yeah, Rakshit.
Vikram was saying, in fact, if you think of the ideation of Nalanda, how it came out to be, everyone knows the story of Kumaragupta, also known as Mahendra Aditya. He got the Mahendra as one of Indra's epithets. And Aditya was Vikramaditya, also Shakraditya, another epithet that he had gone by. He had 2 wives, a little bit of maybe a nice a fact 101 or a history lesson here. Anantadevi and Devaki. Anantadevi was a princess and Devaki was a commoner. Now Devaki, Anantadevi had a huge problem, as is very common in soap operas, in Indian soap operas, where one of the wives will be like, nahi,
base level ego issue.
Exactly, cannot stay in the same palace. How can I share? They're going to breathe the same oxygen as a commoner, And Kumaragupta was very affronted by this, but to appease his princess wife, he had told his second wife that, listen, I will build another palace for you. You can go and please, can you please shift there, and so that we don't have to have these conflicts at home. Devaki said, I don't want a palace. Instead, build me a small house where I can spend my life in the service of treating the ill, the sick.
Wow.
Kumaragupta, granted her this desire, and in a newly built hospital at that time had sent her to be an assistant to doctors, and medical practitioners, just to show how advanced our medical, that's another way to exalt our medical history as well, how advanced our sciences have been. So in this practice, she got exposed to the knowledge about Takshashila, universities like Takshashila, where you had stalwart professors like Chanakya and very smart and competent students like Chandragupta Maurya. And she went to her husband and said, let's also build a university, because at the time she felt, and rightfully so, that Gurukuls, while amazing and exhaustive in their own right as educational epicenters, were not very satisfying in terms of granting specialization courses or just aiming you with certain life skills. So this university was conceptualized, and again, to Vikram's point, at the time the Kumaragupta was thinking about setting up an establishment such as this, a Buddhist philosopher had come to him and told him that while this idea is all fine and dandy, please also include the teachings of Buddhist philosophy and traditions alongside Vedantic traditions. So they were never in conflict with each other from a very, from a conceptual level. Of course, they both have different espousing or different ways of representing or expressing their ideas, but they've always been in harmony with one another. What for me, the takeaway of this is, in terms of, talking about how cosmopolitan or how forward-thinking India was, or our civilization was, you can see true women empowerment or true feminism, the divine femininity at play in such an instance where, today when you think of feminism, unfortunately, it's largely narcissistic and very self-serving. You either have I remember a conversation with you the other day, Akash, where you described it as the Barbie doll generation. It's all about me. But Devaki, from her humble beginnings, also lived very humbly in the service of other people. And without her ideation or her aspirations, we would never have such a rich cultural heritage that the Nalanda University offered us. Of course, we can talk about its
Clearly,
destruction.
I mean, think about it. She was married to a king. She could have gotten a palace and a lot of other things that could have suited her ego. Instead, she demanded for a university or a space for healing, education, and stuff like that. So that is
much better than the OnlyFans generation, if I may say so. So anyway,
absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, so Devaki was very instrumental in that. And even if you think about, okay, of course, before the third and final instance of destruction, there was a huge incentive in that time to sort of, even with the first two destructions, one under the Huns, led by Mihir Kula, or subsequently by the Gaudas, the destruction of the university was not purely for petty reasons or vindictive reasons, as it was in the third. And I'm sure Vikram would love to sort of explain, the significance of Bakhtiyar Khilji's invasion in some way fracturing our Indian ethos and our historical, let's say, fortitude that we had displayed up until that point with much rigor and pride.
Yeah. So this is in continuation with how Indian people perceive their own history, and in terms of what it has become today. We'll find that the main cause of why Indians and the Hindu civilizational cause up until recently was unable to put up a coherent fight to all these false and honestly quite repulsive claims by the left and also by Western scholars and also certain motivated, politically or otherwise motivated elements in asserting that India has no philosophical grounding. It was all complete backwardness. It was all absolutely an age of darkness was India's past, one of oppression, one of no scientific exploration. All of these things have crept up largely because of the destruction which was brought upon the University of Takshashila, of Nalanda mainly, and also of the various other universities which were present at the time, which housed almost all of the knowledge, which housed almost all the civilizational knowledge of this country, whether it came to sciences, mathematics, geometry, trigonometry. We have like epistemology, logic, and also the most significant achievements of this civilization, which are the spiritual texts, the spiritual techniques, which have been documented, perfected, recorded, and translated into Sanskrit over a period of centuries. Millions of such texts, all of them completely burned. You have to understand, this basically means like the Dark Ages essentially descending upon India. With the burning of all this knowledge, this is literally the Dark Ages, because you have all the basis, all the knowledge for how to build anything, how to build a temple, how to instruct somebody on logic, what is the basis of logic, grammar, all of this burnt. All of what we have today, which we acknowledge as our rich history, which we think is so massive and amazing, what we have is less than 3% of what used to be there. And all of this had to be reconstructed, and had to be kind of essentially rediscovered, because the only things which survived the destruction of Nalanda were the things which had been verbatim memorized, such as the Vedas and the Puranas. These were memorized by people verbatim, and that's the only reason they survived, as well as the only reason Indian society became so traditional and so overly protective of itself, and became very superstitious according to regarding certain dates and doing certain rituals, is because the only textual things that survived the destruction of Nalanda were almanacs, were astrological advice books, or were prescriptions for certain ailments. Without the larger body of philosophy and the larger body of goodness and systematic science and how to conduct yourself in the finer aspect of civilization all being destroyed, you only have almanacs and timetables left. Obviously, to preserve whatever little is left of your culture, people became overly ritualistic and overly rigid. And the colonizers took great advantage of this, and they manipulated us into believing that whatever we have, this is your civilization. The Western colonizers who came after the destruction of the Islamic invaders, who were Arab and Turkic, these Western invaders clearly took advantage of the previous destruction to point out that, see, you guys don't actually have any philosophy. Look at us, we are all monotheistic. We know exactly what we want. We have one book. We can tell you exactly what our ideas are. We are so clear about our ideas. Look at what you guys have. You guys only have a bunch of weird rituals done by people on weird dates for no reason. And they systematically educated the intellectual and the forward classes of India of that time in the Western tradition, and they made them believe all of this.
Let's also not forget. Sorry to cut you off there, Vikram. Let's also not forget that a lot of this, let's say, infantilizing our cultural ethos or reducing our traditions to base and very primitive praxeologies, was also in large part due to their inability to understand our scriptures. Because in essence, I'm sure you can speak on this as well, to better understand spirituality or to opine on spirituality, you have to first be a practitioner. But the Western way, or epistemological, let's say, processes that the West has always participated in, is in large part only audio, no video. Wherein they opine about almost everything under the sun without actually experiencing any of it. And even the appointment of, let's say, civil servants in service of their colonial or imperialistic, let's say, motivations and aspirations, was not for the benefit of us as a people, but it was more for them in terms of making it more convenient to trample on our necks and shackle us down.
See, in a certain way, we should also slightly pity the European way of thinking, because this whatever bastardization they've committed upon our cultural texts and our way of understanding our own civilization and how we lived as a lived reality and not just in their intellectual documents. The reason they're unable to process that is because their very method or mode of thinking cannot comprehend such a syncretic civilization. It is impossible for them to even contemplate, like, different people of different beliefs of so much difference living and succeeding together and discovering ways to, make their own processes more efficient. It simply is out of their mindset, because all of you, they're a very monolithic, culture, and they're a very intellectual, overly intellectual kind of, they have an overly intellectual approach to research and also to processing cultural realities, to processing sociological realities, when in fact the reality is often quite porous, it is often quite amalgamous, and that is the wisdom of life. Because dissecting things and separating them into these so-called fake categories, and saying that these are forever separate, might help you to compartmentalize things in your head, but that's not how life happens. That's not how society happens, especially not in a complex, a highly developed culture like India, which has had peace for centuries before all these barbarian marauders came along and messed everything up. We had the time to explore such realities, such complex situations, how to live together despite conflict. And despite all of that, we have common threads. It's not that we are all different. Karma, moksha, liberation, nirvana, meditation, fasting, goodness, good acts, charity, compassion. These are all common traits, which is obvious to any practitioner of any civilizational, tradition of this country will be able to tell you that, nirvana, the state of nirvana and the state of nirvikalpa samadhi are one and the same. Any Siddha will be able to tell you that, which is why the Siddha tradition, which is why the Tibetan tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism is even today called the Siddha tradition. Their masters are called Siddhas, same as the Bengal Shaiva tradition. Why such commonalities exist? So all these reality facts of actual spirituality and religion have been conveniently ignored by people who want to separate us and justify us by saying, anyway, you are fragmented, so you deserve to be conquered. Hum unified hai, so we will rule over you. That is the same narrative which was essentially brought forth by the Turkic Arab invaders and their Mongoloid descendants, and also the Western conquerors who piggybacked on that mindset. And all of this was done due to all the roots of this. Why we are unable to combat this is due to the destruction of all the knowledge which was there in the universities and the temple knowledge systems. I'd like to stop there.
Well said. Here's something I would like to add on to it. Our traditions and cultures often promoted experiential and experimentative attitude towards our texts. We were not a culture that believed in passing down information through a rote learning perspective. What people often don't realize is that dharmic traditions were part of a larger ecosystem which was meant to help human beings explore finer aspects of their being. Now, if you think about it, our scriptures, which are at times often looked at from a purely Western intellectual and philosophical paradigm, tend to give a very incorrect idea about them, because these texts are in fact instruction manuals for practicing of spiritual techniques. They are instruction manuals for the practitioner, which means that there is a certain lineage that he or she may have followed through, or a certain internal experience from where they may have come through. So it's not just a rote learning culture. So that's something I would like to add on to, because this is a very fine aspect that people need to really ingrain within their sense, within their minds. They need to stop dissecting between Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions and Sikh traditions, because they're essentially part of the larger ecosystem. That's what I think about it. What are your opinions on this?
So I would simply point out that yes, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And it is true that this dissection has taken place. But why has this dissection taken place? Why is it that all of this, false notions and this false separation of these different traditions and pigeonholing them and, fooling the public and, changing history? Why has all of this happened? All of this happened simply because the European method of studying texts is problematic on a twofold basis. The first fold is that it simply, as you said, it simply looks at texts which are the product of the realization of the seers or of deep spiritual experience. It looks at these texts and it looks at them from a very cerebral perspective, from a very cerebral, intellectual, ye philosophical wala perspective. What it does not do is look upon it as a practical instruction booklet in which you practice certain techniques to attain certain states of consciousness, because the entire method and the entire reason why India and Indians used to do things back in those days was not from a survival perspective. It was always from a perspective of, expanding your experience.
The very culture was designed that way, like
exactly. The entire
our festivals are
precisely.
And they were very
Every
much in
single
tune
aspect.
with the natural ecosystem as well. So we were never really, pretending to be at war with the natural ecosystem around.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
We had and we had certainly found ways and preached ways to use our natural ecosystem to our benefit, to use whatever is around us to uplift our own consciousness, which is a very beautiful way to exist in a way. So this psyche needs to be reintroduced in the Indian society, where they look at it from a different lens. They look at it as an ecosystem and not just a tradition or a certain a dogmatic instruction being followed by a certain community. It's part of a larger ecosystem. Yes, Rakshit,
well,
you wanted to say something.
Rakshit, please. Yeah.
No, just like 20 seconds, Vikram. Also, I think we should also not go over the fact that it's by design, Abrahamic traditions in general, they follow this Kelsenian Grundnorm formula, in the sense where they are not, it's inconceivable to have something which is not a fundamental final authority. This is where we speak about, usually in the Vedadic traditions, we talk about Gnostics and Astics. Gnostic is not, in another discussion we had spoken about this, Gnostic does not translate to atheism, quote unquote, when you, from the Eurocentric interpretation of the word. Basically means that you don't consider the Vedas as the pramana or the final supreme authority. Abrahamic faiths by design are incompatible with the idea that you don't always need one foundational block to interpret your entire cultural zeitgeist or entire spiritual zeitgeist or your spiritual endeavor. You can have multiple, let's say, bedrocks on which you build your spirituality upon. And this is, I think, very particular to Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism more colloquially, or Buddhism. And when I say Hinduism, I include Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism to an extent as well. I think that one problem is that they are just unable to carry out such an interpretation that we are, enshrined with ever since our, in some sense,
I would like to add something to it. So, in the autobiography of a yogi written by Paramahansa Yogananda, there is this portion where he talks about, where he's in a conversation with someone else, and that person tells him that, okay, you have been trying certain techniques, but have you had direct anubhava of the Brahman, direct experience? About Vedas, I would like to add something. Swami Vivekananda once said that to him, each sentence spoken by Ramakrishna is far more of value than what's written in the Vedas. But I would like to point out that it's one thing when a realized saint like Swami Vivekananda says this, and another instance when a person who's come from a very intellectual, surface level idea of a certain text tries to dispute Vedas. These two are very different contexts. So we need to experientially look into it, or we need to at least, or even on an intellectual level, dig a bit deeper. If somebody is disagreeing, why are they disagreeing? Where are they really coming from? Have they experimented with it? Have they, as the famous saying goes, don't knock it until you tried it, right? So have some people who are opposing the Vedas, have they actually tried to live it first? That's something that I do think has a certain value.
Absolutely, Akash. And Beautifully said. And to emphasize a little bit more on the point that you both have made regarding the Abrahamic sense of having a monolithic source of all your literature and your culture, and also about like the lack of experience. Both of these elements come together in creating the absolute cataclysm that is today's Indian psyche, which is completely, has been overrun completely by like, false phenomena and a false consciousness. And all this is based upon layers of lies, one lie legitimizing the other. This is the way Western citation systems have worked. It is like one person takes a deliberate mistranslation and writes a book based on the false ideas of that mistranslation. Somebody else in the future quotes that messed up work which used the messed up translation, and this creates a chain event. This creates like a chain event and like an unbreakable circle of lies in which one lie is justified by another lie which was previously written a few decades ago.
It's almost like a game of Chinese whispers that's been done by certain academics.
Exactly, and with everything, with every whisper, the lie and the torment of the Indian consciousness becoming worse.
I think Manusmriti is the best example to illustrate such a phenomenon.
Dude, speaking of Manusmriti, how many Hindu houses actually have Manusmriti in their house? Like,
exactly.
Some people make such a big deal about Manusmriti.
Everybody talks about Manusmriti as if everybody is, So the problem with this Western mind, again, this is an Abrahamic mindset, because everybody thinks, oh, Manusmriti is the source of all this oppression. Abhi, Manusmriti kaun padhta hai? Who do you know has a Manusmriti or even read the Manusmriti? How many Hindus do you know have read the Manusmriti? They haven't. The reality.
You will know Manu as a sage.
And moreover, why should they read the Manusmriti?
Yeah.
Why should the real question that Hindus need to ask themselves today, and something that all these are so-called trad brothers need to ask themselves: why should you read the Manusmriti? Because a Smriti, by definition, is a set of codified laws or principles or ethical behaviors or moral codes, which is relevant only for a particular period of time in history.
Exactly.
It's always supposed to be rewritten. A Smriti is always supposed to be rewritten as per the time of the model. That much leeway our culture has always had, which has always confused these Abrahamic fellows, because the problem is, for them, laws are unchanging. The Bible, the word of God, is unchanging. The commandments of God are unchanging. The words received by the saints who are Moses and
Abraham, commenting on that, to be very honest, even the story of Moses, if you really go by it, the story goes something like this. When Moses got his realization or his command from God, he actually came down and he broke the previous set of laws. So in a way, Moses was the lawgiver, but he was also the first lawbreaker, because he broke the previous set of laws and he told his community that, hey, a new set of instructions has arrived. So even Abrahamic traditions do have this culture. It's just maybe distorted in a few minds.
Well, it is simple. Abrahamic cultures are probably misinterpreting themselves, but that is a knot that they need to extricate themselves out of. Because the problem is, they, as a result of their own complications and misunderstandings of their own spiritual traditions, they have brought destruction upon other parts of the world, which have had a finer understanding. Even the words of Jesus, who was probably a great saint, have been completely misrepresented and completely twisted to today, pursue absolute campaigns of hatred. But see, we don't have to go into all of this. What we have to stick to is what has been done to the Indian traditions, which in my sense, the only reason they are unable to see Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism as one continuous whole is because they're saying, where is the text? Where is the one text which is creating all of this unity? This obsession with text, this obsession with one work, is inherently incompatible with the Indian ethos, because the Indian ethos is perfectly exemplified by Jain philosophy, in which the Jain philosophy says one of the highest concepts of Jain philosophy is the concept of anekantavada, which means innumerable perspectives. The truth is so massive and the truth is so infinite that even if you see it in an infinite ways, all of them are correct.
Essentially, if you think about it, our ecosystem was very interested and still is very interested in creating more authors. So naturally, we don't have a lot of emphasis on books. We are creating authors who will be writing a lot of volumes upon volumes of books. So in order to write down something, some experience needs to happen, right? So a culture that's creating authors, naturally the primary focus is on getting the direct anubhava, the direct experience of what.
Yes.
So
And that is the source
Texts
of
for
all our
us,
literature.
as we discussed, exactly.
See,
Texts, as we discussed earlier, were essentially instruction manuals for the practitioner. So
Exactly.
we need to remember this while we are reading our texts.
And what is very, very one last important thing which I'll just point out before handing over the mic to Rakshit, because I'm sure he has a lot to add, is that one very important aspect which we've forgotten is what is the source of all this spiritual literature. You understand, all of this spiritual literature, the source, unless the person has done sadhana, has worshipped a deity, has done spiritual, who has worked on his consciousness, only these people would write all these texts. So our texts are not commandments, are not like laws drafted, so everybody needs to listen to them. These are recordings of individual experience intended to be guide maps and road maps for those who will come after. And that is the fundamental difference between, like, the way Indian knowledge was compiled and stored, and the way it was written and the way it was transmitted, and the way Western knowledge systems were transmitted, because they largely relegated themselves to the products of their mind. While the contents of India's spiritual literature were products of understanding consciousness, which is seen in various different ways, which is why it appears to be so different. But what brings all of these different, traditions together, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, is because they all saw the underlying truth of that one consciousness, of that supreme truth, of self-realization, of enlightenment. These are all the same truths which were seen, and the paths of Astika and Nastika paths are different belief systems which you kind of have to set upon yourself, and the different methods you can follow in order to achieve that one indescribable truth. By the way, in the
maybe
Buddhists
there are
also,
different guidelines for different kinds of psyche. People have different kinds of psyche, so maybe there are different guidelines to suit to their liking.
Precisely, you hit the nail on the head, because this is the only tradition which understood that human beings are bloody unique. And you can't give everybody just one instruction manual and say, "Sab ek hi karo." Like you find a goldfish and you say, like, now you learn how to climb a banyan tree. Like, it doesn't make any sense, like, to even do that, because, like, it's like trying to create a classroom with different animals, like a monkey, a goldfish, like, like a dolphin, a tiger, and you say, okay, now all of you will now climb a banyan tree. Like, to pass the exam, to qualify as, like, a true spiritual seeker, all of you will now climb the banyan tree, which is absolute nonsense, which is something that we realize that is so stupid. We realized this thousands of years ago. Some people took so much time, they still haven't understood it. And these people want to come and lecture us as to, like, what is today. These are the people who lecture us about tolerance, who lecture us about, like, inclusivity. When in fact, this tradition is the one which birthed inclusivity, which birthed, like, the idea of coexistence. And we were able to do that. Simply because we understood that a difference of opinion is simply a different perspective on the truth, as long as it conforms to certain logical realities and certain, like, basic senses of logic.
Flavor. It's a certain additional flavor, So
Precisely.
Different views, different opinions, different schools of thought are essentially different flavors that have been added to a dish in a way. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what makes a
But the
dish
common
beautiful.
element of the journey of the soul, the journey of the individual, of the path of self-realization, this narrative is what forms the narrative of India. Because India's lesson and contribution to the world, which today we have forgotten, and we think India is a lot of things. We think India is about cult, we think India is about samosas, and we think India is about holika colors. Like, I mean, it is about that. But what is the true ethos of India? The true essence of India is teaching the world and recommending to the world that, look around, guys, the physical world is not the only world. There is self-realization. Look at your consciousness. Figure out who you are.
Even if you don't go at that level, and if you just talk about it from a purely physical point of view, a lot of our cultural traditions, right, they were designed in such a way that even the person who's living a normal grihastha life, who's not a monk, even for them, if they follow the tradition properly, they will keep their body and mind in a very pleasant state. For example, Ekadashi fasting, right? A lot of people think, oh, what is this Ekadashi fasting? Where has this popped up from? But if you look at it, every month you're getting a cleansing done for your system. So you're actually keeping yourself in good health. If you're in good health, you'll not be falling sick that often. You'll actually be exploring other avenues. Your curiosity will naturally arise. You will look for information around. So these aspects are there. Like our culture was designed. Our culture was very specifically designed in such a way that even a person living a grihastha life can have a taste. Very pleasantly they can have a taste. So this is something that people need to like recognize. They need to see
Not
the
only a
larger
taste,
picture around.
actually, not only a taste, because there were so many realized masters who come from the Grihastha tradition.
A lot, quite a lot.
Quite a few of them, actually.
In fact, a beautiful way I think I would, try to illustrate, to encapsulate the Indian tradition or the traditional ethos or zeitgeist from the West is that while the West obsesses over this idea of assimilation, we exalt the virtue of accommodation. We are more about accommodation over assimilation. Assimilation, it functions on this basic presumption that the only way for harmonious coexistence is if you transform yourself into a vessel for our virtues, for our values, for our traditions. Whereas the Indic ethos allows you to maintain your belief systems, maintain your truths, maintain your values, because we fundamentally believe that all paths lead to Brahman. Okay? As long as you are conscious about certain dharmic universalities and actualities, it is a land where everyone is welcome. Vasudeva Kutumbakam is not just a cool Facebook or Instagram bio. It means something. But at the same time, it also requires accommodation to be a reciprocal exercise, an exercise in reciprocity. So I think that is one, very unique feature about the Indic ethos. And I'd also like to add, when we were speaking about, how Indians, ourselves, are so obsessed with the Western way of thought, it's even crept into our very jurisprudence or our jurisdictional processes, in the sense where our judicial processes now follow something called as the essential practices test. Why this is such a difficult sort of, it's a very implausible or a very impractical process to adjudicate upon, because we cannot reduce our entire faith systems to one practice or two practices. That is fundamentally what sets us apart from Western theocracy. And in some sense, we are not a theocracy. In some sense, while it has been widely used and it's the most memed statement of this generation is Hinduism is a way of life and not a faith. Ironically, it was the Supreme Court that coined this while establishing the essential practices test. And it's such an inherent, it's so contradictory in and of itself to, on the one hand, call Hinduism a way of life, and on the other hand, reduce it down to a few mundane essential practices. And the worst part of it all is when you have, let's say, a forgery case in the court of law, you usually introduce a handwriting expert. But when you have to adjudicate upon matters relating to faith, specifically the Hindu Dharma, why don't you bring experts from the community? The consensus on who can be the expert, that we can collectively decide. That's our business. But this idea that the court assumes authority over deciding, matters close to us, like temple governance or state control on donations of how Hindu money or Hindu community money is dispersed, it's such an Abrahamic way, it's expressed in such an Abrahamic way, where if it's not written in any of our books, it cannot be true. That is the assumption, unfortunately.
Well, actually, I would say Rakshit is being quite diplomatic in the way he's breaking this down. In fact, I would say the essential practices rule or the principle is actually one of the greatest frauds upon Dharma, which has been committed. And unfortunately, it has been committed at a time, when India has become independent. And by a Supreme Court which is contradicting itself, I will not comment anything much more to avoid being in contempt of court. But I will say, I would remark that as a citizen of this country and as a practicing Hindu, it makes no sense, as Rakshit said, to in the same breath say that, okay, this is a way of life, and then say there are essential practices. Because the reality is this idea of essential practices itself being like the so-called main aspects of a religion, this itself comes from this idea that, you know, like jo bhi ek religion ke bare mein likhna chahiye, all that will be there from coming from a book. All that will be coming from a certain source, which is now verifiable by us, independently verifiable by us. And, you know, in terms of whether verifying or not, whether something is an actual custom or something, whether something is an actual like tradition of that you know, particular lineage or of that particular practice, please call the experts from that community. Oh, no, we won't call those experts because they are all like biased. They all will be biased towards their own community, and, you know, they are not qualified. You know, people who are trained in that tradition and who have spent their entire lifetimes practicing it, no, they are not qualified to interpret the tradition. Okay, but we are qualified. You know, we are qualified because we are wearing a gown, and, you know, we have been empowered by the constitution, which, by the way, I would like to point out that it is not unconstitutional or unpatriotic to say the constitution is simply 70 years old. Okay, the constitution is 70 years old, and these laws which we are so proud to uphold today, and these so-called legal reasonings which we use today to uphold all of these draconian laws, such as the essential practices and control of, you know, in Hindu temples and all that, all of these laws and all of this legal jargon which has been used to legitimize all of this, is coming from where? Is coming from English common law. Let's acknowledge the reality, guys. It's English common law. There's nothing Bharatiya about this. There's nothing civilizational about this. Okay, so how do we expect?
In fact, the very drafting of Indian Constitution, if you really look into it, it was made by the Constituent Assembly, which was essentially selected by the British. So it wasn't even like, you know, a survey was done which inquired about what is the common voice of Indian population. It was essentially an assembly selected by the Britishers. Yes, amendments have taken place, but the very foundational document was sort of created in a very indirect fashion, if you really look into the history
I would point out that while the creators of the constitution were very well intentioned and very, very educated and enlightened people for their time, unfortunately they were also victimized by the post-colonial experience. The problem is that all the intellectuals who were available in India at the time of independence in the 1950s before the 1950s, in the late 1940s, when the Constitution of India was being drafted in the mid 40s and the late 40s, is who are the intellectuals, who are the ones who were educated enough, who are the ones who could even participate in such a draconian measure? Only those who had spent the last 200 years being educated in the English tradition, who had spent their entire educational and professional lives maybe studying in England, studying in Europe, being told by the Indian education system that, you know, like, tumhare ancestors conquer ho gaye the, they were conquered by us, our legal systems are superior, our education systems are superior, you were benighted, we saved you from social backwardness. All of these narratives which are so strong today in post-independent India, when so many lies are being peddled to us. Imagine the lies which were peddled to them at that time. And all the people who were in the Constituent Assembly of India at the time of framing of the Constitution were all people educated by the education systems of pre-independent India. They were all educated in pre-independent India. So imagine what their mind state would have been. How can we even expect them? How can we even expect them after like such a horrible colonial experience and their entire social consciousness being ripped from them systematically? How can we expect them to be like, you know, Indian or Indic or having discovered all of this, which even today, after with the age of the internet, we're still not able to figure out all of these things completely. How can we expect them to do it? Considering all of that, they did a pretty good job. Dr. Ambedkar and the Constituent Assembly have done a stellar job and they've actually ended up, by using Western means, by taking the best parts of Western realities, they've actually managed to create a constitution which has so many Indian aspects, just so many Hindu aspects to it, civilizational aspects to it, inadvertently or on purpose. And the problem is, all these Hindu civilizational aspects of the constitution, such as the first copy of the constitution having a picture of Rama returning to Ayodhya after his exile and all of the other things, are systematically excluded from the popular consciousness of the country, the popular education of the country. None of these facts are told. None of these ideas are told. Everybody thinks India, 1947, 15th August, we became an independent country. 1950, somebody gave us we all created a constitution and we became India. And before that, there was only, you know, independence struggle. Uske pehle hum sab, you know, we are all gawar the. This is the mindset that has been foisted upon India. And if that is the mindset that has been foisted, how do you expect modern day Indians to look back with pride on their history? Because all their history is destruction and backwardness and darkness. So in this manner, the colonial project has been very, very successful. So the way in which we must reverse it is by genuinely doing our own reading, getting in touch with our cultural aspects, also understanding that a lot of so-called traditional aspects of our culture are actually effects of colonization, which are effects to which were like a product of a very, very horrible time in which we were forced to safeguard our culture. They need not be relevant today. Sanatana Dharma is an eternal law, which means it can always be modified. And its fundamental truths are one of unity or of one of the journey of humanity and of consciousness. And if we don't settle our differences right now and figure out our stuff, there is all this narrative of Bharat is Vishwa Guru and all that is just, just like, it's just Fugazi, it's just in the wind. It doesn't really mean anything. Because if we want to be Vishwa Guru, we're not even able to teach ourselves. Where are we going to become the Vishwa Guru? So I would like to close with that, with a realistic statement.
I think one small addition to that as well is, while I fully agree that we have to do our own reading and our own research into a lot of these, and in a sense, like an epistemic delinkage, for the lack of a better phrase, we need to get over this obsession with Western methods of research. I think it has creeped into academia as a cancer for far too long. And while you have the Amartya Sens of this world, or the Ramila Thapars sitting in their ivory towers, opining, from their armchairs about how measly and how, dogmatic or hinged us Indians are, while sipping their coffee and typing on their MacBooks, we have fallen for this trap that I would label as Western liberal education. I am not saying that the West has not contributed to a significant degree in shaping modern education. We have some pluses, but this obsession of, sacrificing everything Indian about knowledge at the altar of pleasing the Harvards and Columbia universities of the world needs to stop. I think that is the need of the hour in terms of, actually learning our own history from reputable sources, not reputable under the aegis of Western academia, but Bharatiya academia.
So I would point out that yes, Rakshit, you're right regarding the Western models of research. And in terms of what do you think would be like an alternative to that? How do you think we could pursue an alternative approach to research which doesn't rely upon, upon sources which quote other sources which are corrupted, and it's just an entire line of corruption, which is, just creating an illusion of unbreakable truth that the West is right about India, and that their
fundamentally, like,
and their...
how could an ecosystem be aided or be created which actually promotes Indic views, which promotes indigenous interpretations of cultural texts, sacred texts, practicing instructions, etc. What could be a way out?
So I think firstly, like Vikram sort of subtly hinted to, we need to stop looking at translations and interpretations of texts and actually try sourcing the original texts themselves. For this, I personally believe that Sanskrit should be the national language. Okay, that way it's a great way, not just in terms of it being the lingua franca of our texts, of our original texts and scriptures, but also it's a good way to politically sort of harmonize the divide between the south and the north of India in a lot of ways. Na hamara, na aapka. Right?
I mean, in a way, if you think about it, there's this idea that, English is very like fundamental because
exactly.
It connects India
I
to
understand,
the world, but that's not really true, because look at China.
True.
Chinese. Look at Japan.
China,
people
Japan
who need to converse in English, the business communities and the other classes, they will anyway end up learning English. But anyway, about the national language, I don't know. But one thing that I do believe is that there are already a lot of indigenous voices, indigenous interpretations, but they often end up getting refrained to their communities or to their circles, Not often do we see a trend wherein they actually come out and publish their viewpoints, get it in text, because in a few years, actually already it's happening. Algorithm has a certain place. So if our voices, if our indigenous voices are out there, the algorithm itself is going to assist us. One of the reasons why Western forms of interpretation often end up dominating the space around is because they had been publishing a lot of their articles through years and years of a particular form of education. But nowadays we can change that, because anybody with access to internet can actually write an article and publish it, and that will affect the algorithm. So next time around, if somebody Googles something about an Indian culture or an Indian practice or a Hindu practice, they will actually find indigenous sources about it, and not some article that may have been covered by, I don't know, a historian or an anthropologist from
Well,
BBC UK.
Well, I think that, you guys are actually not so much, you guys are actually talking about pretty much the same thing, actually, because see, when Akash, you say rightly so that we need to write more articles from our indigenous side, and there might be a lot of voices which are actually not being heard, and if they actually are heard, if we actually put out the information, it will affect the algorithm. But what Rakshat is saying is actually a little bit more fundamental than that, a little bit more like one step before that. Because in order to create legitimate indigenous narratives and legitimate indigenous interpretations, the indigenous people themselves need to know what exactly their own texts are talking about. Because this alienation from Indian culture and Indian texts has happened to Indian society largely because of ignorance and lack of access to the knowledge systems. So
the very education system was cut now. So in a way, like the very roots were attacked, because where were the gurukuls when we were going?
And I'm not saying don't teach English. English is very essential from a geopolitical standpoint, right? In terms of international commerce in an increasingly globalized world.
I hear you.
Now, whether you agree with globalization or not is a different matter altogether. But say it is what it is, and English is instrumental in being able to converse with the world or commerce with the world.
Yes, and English forms a very, very important core language, which allows like Indians from different parts of the country who until they can agree upon like an Indian language.
It's a powerful tool. Essentially, it's a powerful tool to actually put our voice out there in a language that is largely recognized by huge number of people across the globe. So it's a very powerful tool, no doubt about it.
But that being said, it's only a stopgap. Because the reality is a lot of one of the main reasons for which like why Indian esoteric concepts and Indian spiritual concepts have been largely misunderstood and the misunderstanding is being propagated across the world is because English is not really a language equipped.
Absence of appropriate words to translate from our text.
Precisely. Because English is not really equipped to discuss such concepts. English is not derived, is not created to discuss and even communicate these ideas in a very efficient manner, while Sanskrit is the exact opposite. Sanskrit was developed scientifically, was a scientifically engineered language. It is not a language which ended up coming out of like the colloquial speaking of people. It was creatively engineered mathematically and grammatically to make it a language which made it very easy to discuss very, very complicated philosophical realities and very, very complicated states of consciousness, many of which only have equivalents in Sanskrit. And today, the fact that Sanskrit has acquired this kind of notion that it is a kind of oppressive, Brahminical, patriarchal language which was used to subjugate everybody in the country, which is absolute nonsense, is a narrative again propagated by British imperialist apologists as a vestige of the Aryan invasion theory to justify their own invasions. It's a complete nonsense.
There have been several women saints in our tradition who have been upheld and respected in a very
I don't mean patriarchal in that sense. I don't mean patriarchal in that sense. I mean patriarchy in
terms I get you. I hear you. I'm just saying, like, in this tradition, this very idea of patriarchy, I don't know, maybe it was a perversion that took place in some format, but that's not what the tradition and culture actually stands for or even remotely promotes.
No, absolutely not. And to brand an entire language which was the scientific root and the scientific basis for discussing something and for like discussing highly complicated philosophical ideas and religious ideas and scientific ideas, a language was used for that, and a language which clearly has value even today, to demonize their entire language as patriarchal and Brahminical should show the fact that how such poor understanding of Indian culture, society, and also even human history for that matter, and such little value accorded by certain segments of society towards this language. And it's like saying Latin was used to perform black magic in certain medieval times. Therefore, Latin itself is like an oppressive and a satanic language, which you will not hear any of the Christians talking about, to be very honest. So what we need to do here is we can't wait for other people and other how do I put this? Other sources from other places in the planet to tell us what Sanskrit is supposed to be and what our lingua franca is supposed to be and how we're going to go about our decolonization. We got to take the matter in our own hands as Indians and start to read the original text and figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. In fact, I just wish that we can reach a day when we fully acknowledge our traditions and cultures more fully and more sufficiently.
And lastly, I would like to suggest that truly understanding Indian culture and Indian texts, I would say to my Indian brothers and sisters as well, is impossible without some amount of spiritual practice. Is absolutely impossible. And this is clearly mentioned by various gurus and of various paramparas, where they say the truths of God, the truths of Indian literature, the truths of the Vedas can only truly be understood through experience, through sadhana, through meditation, through exploring consciousness, through worship, through bhakti, through jnana, whatever your path may be. And there are assortment of paths in Hinduism. Without some exposure to the spiritual truths of Hinduism, just being a political Hindu will simply divorce you further from your culture.
Thank you, Vikram, for the opinion shared. On that note, I would like to call for concluding remarks from the two of you. Rakshit, I would like you to go first.
Thanks, Akash. I would just like to conclude with a small prayer that we one day reach a time when we embrace our vast swaths of history and traditions that honestly I don't say this with any arrogance, but I do firmly believe that we have been fundamental in shaping the entire world, because most of our principles are highly universalistic and humanistic and humanitarian in nature. And I think that whether we agree about Sanskrit being the national language or not, I think one thing that we can agree is that the youth of India today has to invoke the Bharatiyata in them and strive for what our ancestors left, strive to sort of achieve and maintain what our ancestors before us couldn't. And this would be the only prayer that I have moving forward with this organization and just generally in life. Thank you.
Amazing.
Exceptionally well said. And I would say, I would actually like to add on to what Rakshit said and say that, yes, this culture has produced some of the greatest gems of human knowledge. And I believe some of the most important works regarding the journey of the human being and the highest levels to which we can reach as human individuals, this knowledge has been given to us by India and its masters and our ancestors. To be divorced from this kind of heritage and to reclaim that heritage, it's not going to be easy. To get rid of that, to get rid of this feeling of being alienated from this culture, that's not going to be easy, because the amount of illusion, the amount of obfuscation, and the kind of manipulation and deep kind of how do I put this, corruption of our literature and of our tradition and our way of thinking is something that we need to reverse step by step. And I would like to reiterate again, and maybe I don't sound like I'm beating a dead horse. I think the people of India need to become in touch with their civilizational consciousness and even if you're not able to practice a spiritual path, or you are not a spiritual person, you're a more practical person, pick up a piece of Indian literature, pick up a piece of Indian philosophy, maybe the Upanishads, maybe even the Puranas, which are very, very interesting stories. Pick up some mythology, try to read it, and try to understand what the voices of our ancestors are trying to tell us. Because those messages aren't really talking about one group of people or one set of people who are living in one place. It's the story of humanity. It's always the story of humanity. It's always the story of our collective relationship to the cosmos. And once we understand this element of our culture, all the other dirty elements which have crept into us and what has been forced upon us by other outsiders and by Indians who have gotten corrupted in their minds and all that will automatically separate itself like the wheat from the chaff. So the key is to develop a sense of a deeper sense of spirituality and a larger vision through first getting basic education. Read one piece of Indian literature every day and you will notice a market change in your vision of our culture and our idea of ourselves. I'd like to stop there.
I would simply urge our audience to express more curiosity with respect to the traditions and the rituals they may observe around them. Ask relevant questions and ask it with a clean heart, with a true intention to know. Just express more curiosity. There are teachers available, there are people available who can show you a light for that question. Just express your curiosity. Don't keep it within yourself. That's a very simple thing I would like our audience to practice. On that note, I would like to call for an end with respect to this episode. We will be returning with more episodes very soon. Pranam.